Fallout 4 can be rough in the early game. You move through new areas slowly, expecting enemies around every corner, your weapon barely does damage, you burn through ammo way too fast, and every fight feels like a risk. That's when the game feels the most engaging. But at some point that changes. You level up, pick a few perks, and suddenly the game just stops pushing back. Enemies go down quickly, you're not really worried about ammo anymore, and fights start to feel easy. There's a point where the game goes from survival to control. So what actually changed? And more importantly, once you understand why this happens, you can actually make the game feel challenging again. It's not because enemies get weaker, they don't. The difficulty shifts because several systems in the game scale in your favor, and they scale faster than enemies do. And once those systems start working together, the entire balance of the game changes. So the first thing that changes is how long fights actually last. Early on, enemies just take a lot of hits. You empty almost an entire magazine into a single target, reload in the middle of the fight, and they're still standing. That's not just because your weapon is weak. It's because your damage simply isn't high enough yet for how much health they have. But once you get further into the game, that relationship flips. I tested this against gunners. Early game, with a basic pipe rifle, it took around 16 body shots to take one down. And since the magazine only holds 12 rounds, you're forced to reload mid-fight. Late game, with a combat rifle and a few damage perks, that same type of enemy, actually a stronger version, goes down in about 5 to 6 shots. No reload, no drawn out fight, just a clean kill. And that's the important part. Even though enemies get stronger, they don't get stronger fast enough. Your damage scaling overtakes them, and once that happens, fights don't just get easier, they get shorter. But raw damage isn't the whole story, because even if your weapon says it deals a certain amount of damage, that's not what enemies actually take. Every enemy has armor, and that armor reduces your damage before it even hits their health. So early on, you're not just dealing low damage, a big part of it gets reduced on top of that. And this is where perks start to make your damage much more effective. I tested this with the same weapon against the same enemy. With no perks, it took around 12 to 18 shots. Just adding Rifleman cut that down to about 6 or 7. But here's the interesting part. Adding another damage perk on top of that barely changed anything, because not all damage bonuses work the same way. Rifleman doesn't just increase your damage, it also ignores part of the enemy's armor. Which means more of your damage actually goes through. Other perks just increase the number, but that number still gets reduced. Some upgrades feel huge, others barely move the needle. It becomes clear why your damage suddenly feels much more effective later on. Up to this point, fights are just getting faster. But this is where something more important changes. Early on, every fight costs you resources. You spend ammo, you use stimpaks, and by the end of it, you're usually worse off than before. So you have to think about every fight. Is it worth it? Do I have enough ammo? Can I even afford this? But once your damage becomes more efficient, that flips. I tested this in the same area. Early game, I started with 1000 rounds and ended the fight with around 800. That's a huge loss. Late game, same idea. Start with 1000 rounds, clear the same type of enemies, and end up with more ammo than I started with. And that's the turning point. From here on, fights don't cost you anything anymore. They actually give you resources. You're using fewer shots per enemy, and they drop enough ammo to cover that, and more. So the question changes. It's no longer, can I afford this fight? It becomes, why wouldn't I take it? That's when resources stop limiting you. And this is where everything starts to stack. And once that happens, the game doesn't just get easier step by step, it crosses a threshold. But even that isn't the biggest change. Because at some point, fights don't just get easier, they stop being reactive. Early on, combat usually starts the same way. You get spotted, enemies rush you, and you have to deal with whatever happens. But once you start using stealth, that dynamic changes. I tested this in the same area. Walking in normally, I get detected almost immediately. Multiple enemies react, start shooting, and the fight just unfolds. But approaching the same group in stealth, they don't even know I'm there. They go into caution, fire in random directions, but never actually find me. and I can just pick them off one by one. No pressure, no real risk. The fight only happens because I decide it does. And that's the key difference. Combat is no longer something you react to, it's something you control. And once you have that level of control, there's one more step. You don't have to fight anymore. Early on, when you enter a new area, you just run into whatever is there. Enemies spot you, combat starts, and you deal with it. But later in the game, that changes. I tested this in the same location. Walking indirectly, the fight starts immediately, multiple enemies engage, and you're forced into it. But taking a different approach, just observing the area, watching where enemies are, and choosing a path around them, you can just walk straight through. No combat, no risk, nothing happens at all. And that's the final shift. You're not just winning fights more easily, you're deciding which fights even happen. So if you put all of this together, early game is defined by limitations. You deal low damage, you spend a lot of resources, fights happen whether you want them or not, and you're constantly reacting. But later in the game, all of that flips. You deal more effective damage, fights get shorter. They stop costing resources, you control how they happen, or if they happen at all. And that's the real reason the game gets easier. It's not just one system breaking, it's all of them working together. And once you understand that, you can actually reverse it. If you want the game to stay challenging, you don't need mods or higher difficulty. You just need to limit those systems. Use less optimized damage perks, avoid turning fights into a resource farm, don't rely on stealth for every fight, and don't avoid fights completely. Because once you remove that control, the challenge comes back immediately. If you found other ways to make the late game more challenging, write them in the comments. I'm curious what approaches you are using. And if there are other Fallout 4 systems you want broken down like this, let me know as well. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. And if you want more explanations like this, subscribe. Stay irradiated, and I'll see you in the next video.